Well, no end in sight for soaring gas prices. The average price of a gallon now well over $4 as the U.S. experiences its worst battle with inflation in decades.
I know that families all across America are hurting because of inflation. I want every American to know that I'm taking inflation very seriously, and it's my top domestic priority.
So we have a lot to discuss with a member of the president's cabinet. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg joins us. Thank you, Secretary. Appreciate you joining us this evening. Good evening to you. So President Biden
Good evening. Good to be
calls
with you.
inflation his #1 priority. It is at a 40-year high. So what does the administration plan to do about it? And people don't want long-term plans. They don't want to hear about it. They want action now.
Well, the president laid out a number of specific steps, many of them already underway and more to come. And I think that's the most important thing about today's message. Not just that the president's saying it's a priority, but he's making clear what we're doing about it. Some of it is the measures that he's already taken to stabilize or help stabilize global oil markets, which affects gas prices. Some of it's action which he has advanced in Congress to do things like lower the cost of prescription drugs, cap insulin at $35, lower the cost of childcare, internet access, and other measures. Now, some of those have been blocked by congressional Republicans, but other measures are underway and are making a difference. Then you have the supply chain side of things. You know, part of what contributes to upward pressure on prices is high costs of shipping. That's why we're making some of the investments that we're making. Some of them, sure, they're long term, but some of them are steps that are operating in the short term, pushing toward 24/7 operations at our ports, working with truck drivers to get more truck drivers trained and keep them on the road, working with rail companies to try to get their fluidity up. This is an all hands on deck moment, and the president laid out today a very clear contrast between a specific series of steps, policy steps, that he's undertaking and proposing, versus the other side, which loves to criticize on this, but either has no plans or has plans that don't make any sense, like raising taxes on the middle class and the poor, just at the moment when Americans are struggling with these high prices.
Well, listen, I want to ask you, because there's another contributing factor, but just while we're on the subject of gas prices, let me go here first. Gas prices have jumped to a new record high, and if we look at this chart that we have up right now, they've gone way up over just the last 9 months. How high is this going to go? And does the administration have any tools to control what has been really a shock to just about everyone's pocket?
Well, there are some tools. Look, when an oil company is deciding how much to charge for a gallon of gas any given day, of course, they don't call the president to check. But when you have actions like the release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and by the way, the president didn't just do that unilaterally. He did one of the things that he committed to do, which is rally international players, allies, and partners to do the same. That had an effect. Were it not for that, prices would be higher than they are now. But the truth is, as long as we are dependent on these kinds of foreign dictators and the fuel they produce, we're going to continue seeing these issues. That's why long term, we got to make sure we reduce our dependence. Short term, the president's taken actions like making more homegrown biofuels available in the near term. These are things that are going to make a difference, even if, again, we know that obviously the gas price is set by global petroleum markets, not by the president of the United States.
Well, let's talk about the other contributing factors to this this unease with the economy that Americans are having. President Biden is blaming the pandemic and Putin's war for inflation. But what about that $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan? The San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank concluded last year, Secretary, that the stimulus contributed to inflation. Shouldn't at least part of the blame be placed on that?
Look, at that time, the country was facing the continued risk of economic collapse. Action had to be taken to bring back the economy, to make sure that Americans had more money in their pockets, that jobs that would have been lost perhaps forever were saved. Now, it is true, right now, we have a lot of the issues that are associated with those very low unemployment rates. Right now, we have fewer people on unemployment than we've had, I think, since 1970. And when that happens, that does create pressures in labor markets. But if you consider the alternative, the possibility that we could have seen the kind of economic collapse that was a very real risk before the American Rescue Plan. There's no question that that was the right thing to do. It has saved countless jobs, likely millions and millions of jobs, and it's one of the reasons why the job creation record of this president in his first year is one that is the most swift creation of jobs in American history.
Yeah, understood. But did it contribute to inflation, as economists say?
Look, I think that historians and economists will be debating the early 2020s and what happened for many years and decades. But right now, we're still living in that moment. Right now, what we've got to do is focus on the tools that are in our hands that will actually help right now. And whether we're talking about counterbalancing the effects of Putin invading a country, obviously when you have a major oil-producing country go to war, that's going to have effects, or whether we're talking about dealing with supply chain issues that have been driven by the pandemic. There are things that we can do, there are things we are doing, and there's more that we can do. Right now, the president's asking for support on this, and what we see coming out of the other side is certainly a desire to throw punches and offer a lot of criticisms over this, but very little by way of actual plans. I mean, raising taxes on the poor and the middle class, I suppose they could argue that could somehow reduce inflation, but that would be a terrible, terrible way to do it.
The president went on offense against the GOP, attacking their, quote, and I'm quoting here, ultra MAGA policies, and he says this, watch.
I understand the frustration, but the fact is congressional Republicans, not all of them, but the mega Republicans are counting on you to be as frustrated by the pace of progress, which they've done everything they can to slow down, that will hand power over to them and so they can enact their extreme agenda.
So President Biden repeatedly hammering MAGA Republicans in his speech there, but Americans are feeling the pinch now while President Biden is in charge. Democrats control the House, they control the Senate. Does that message really work now to say the other guys will be worse?
Well, I think it is important to understand the two very different approaches that exist here. The president has laid out a specific policy program and a specific approach, actions that are underway, more things that we can do and are doing that are going to help lower those costs that Americans are facing. The other side is offering proposals like raising taxes on the poor and the middle class, proposals like getting rid of Medicare and Social Security every 5 years unless Congress recreates them, things that are completely out of step with what's actually going to make a difference here. And I do think, anytime somebody wants to throw stones and criticize, and of course they're going to criticize whoever's in charge, that they be challenged to explain what they would do differently, what they would do to make it any better, whether we're talking about gas prices, whether we're talking about inflation, or any of the other issues that are ferocious issues in our economy, but that the president is squarely facing and leading this country to contend with because he knows how much of an impact it is on families, because he knows that this is something that people are feeling at the kitchen table, feeling at the pump. That's why we need not name-calling, not personal attacks like what we saw from Senator Scott today, but specific policy agendas. And ours, frankly, is just more clear, more cogent, and it's going to be more successful.
Secretary, I do want to ask you about the Supreme Court's upcoming abortion decision, where it appears that Roe v. Wade may be overturned. There will be immediate consequences for women and families. What about other rights, like same-sex marriage? Could that be next?
Well, I think right now the focus, rightly, is on women and the right to choose. And I will say, for all of my life and all of modern American history, I think the direction that we've been going in as a country, the direction that the Constitution has led us to in the Supreme Court has been one of expanding rights, has been one of expanding freedoms. And suddenly, this decision, if this is what the decision will be, represents a retreat from that. The big question is, did we live to see the high watermark of freedom in this country? And now we're going to go back at the expense of women who have, for the last 50 years, been trusted to make these decisions about their own health? or are we going to push forward? But there are, of course, a lot of other Americans who are wondering whether their rights and freedoms might be next. And needless to say, same-sex marriage is an example of a freedom, of a right that was expanded because it was deemed by the Supreme Court to be something that the Constitution protects. And now you got a Supreme Court that, again, if this memo turns into a decision, appears to have very little regard for precedent. And I'm not comforted by any of the reassurances that would not lead to other freedoms falling.
Secretary Buttigieg, thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.